Flangers are responsible for creating some of the most interesting effects landscapes we've ever heard. From the Beatles to Van Halen, Radiohead to producers like Jimmy Douglas. Flangers play a really important role in helping creators express themselves in a way that feels awesome to them and really satisfying to the audiences they're making their music for. And if there was one company that has consistently nailed the sound of flanging and made it so accessible to everyone, that's Boss. So in today's video, we're going to talk about the legendary Boss BF2 flanger and put it head to head with its counterpart, the HF2 high band flanger. Both these are very unique and interesting sounding units that play a great role individually, and as we're about to see in the video, do something really special when they're put together. I've played guitar and made music in the studio pretty much my whole life, and no matter what, it's these two flangers I always come back to. So let's dive in so you can hear both these in action and you can decide for yourself. Let's go. All right, what's up everybody? How's it going? I'm Brad Dollar. Welcome to the channel. It's great to see you. All right, so real quick, what is a flanger? Like, what is this thing even doing? At its simplest definition, the way a flanger operates is that it copies your signal, whatever that is, your guitar, your vocal, or whatever's going into the unit, and then delays one of those copies in little tiny amounts, always changing over time. And usually these little changes are done with an LFO or a low frequency oscillator applied to that delay. And then when you add other parameters that you would find on a delay, like feedback or regeneration, then that's when you go from a slow whoosh of the delay moving back and forth really slowly to that rapid paced metallic ring modulation type sound that happens when you crank a rate control up, for example. Before we had things like Boss BF2s to do it for us automatically, it was originally achieved using two tape machines. Somewhere in the 40s or 50s, no one's really sure of when it happened, engineers started realizing that when they would put two tape machines side by side to create other kinds of effects like delay or even to move tracks between machines, they noticed that if they changed the time that it took for the tape on the second machine to go around, they got a very interesting effect that they hadn't really heard anywhere else or otherwise hadn't been able to replicate. People mostly associate Sir George Martin as the originator of making the sound popular. And with all the hype at that time building around flangers in music and people beginning to use it more on guitars and even keyboards, manufacturers got wise, and by the early 70s, the first dedicated flanger units were coming out. The first popular one, or at least the first popular effects pedal, was the Electro-Harmonix Electric Mistress, which came out in 1976. And it's at this point that Boss decided to jump in the game. Prior to the introduction of the BF2, Boss was already heavily involved in the stomp box realm. The predecessor to the BF2, the BF1, was part of a larger array of pedals that Boss offered, including the highly coveted CE1 chorus and the GE10 equalizer. And by 1979, Boss was moving on from these large, heavy, big power supply having pedals that had dominated the previous decade for them in favor of the more compact design. And by 1980, Boss had phased out the BF1 altogether in favor of the introduction of the BF2. It was one of the first effects that could really compete with the sounds of rack processors found in studios at that time, and people found it useful on everything from guitar to keyboards and even bass. In fact, it was so popular that it really wasn't changed or even updated until the introduction of the BF3 in 2001. So 21 years of this design. And yeah, and as we'll talk about, there was little tiny changes in the chip where it was produced and things like that, but it was the same flanger for over 20 years that found its way on so many pedal boards and in so many studios all over the world. And by 1985, based on the popularity of the BF2, Boss introduced the HF2 high band flanger. The goal of this flanger was to offer musicians and producers a very potent but lighter flanging effect. And they accomplished this by basically adding a crossover that limits the range the effect is actually operating in, really only affecting the top end frequencies. The result is something that's way more shimmering, and the whooshiness of it, such a funny word to keep saying, the whooshiness of it doesn't really affect the low end. So the parts you're playing sound a lot tighter and it's a lot less invasive. It's kind of like if they put a mix knob on the BF2. The trade-off though is you can get a little wilder with it at times. You can let it be a little crazier, and for the most part, it stays out of the way of like everything else that's around it. That said, it wasn't that popular, and by 1993, production was discontinued. Both of these flangers have Japanese and Taiwanese versions. This HF2 high band flanger is a Japanese version, and this BF2 flanger is a Taiwanese version. On paper and in the schematic and in terms of like the values of the components and things like that, nothing is different between the Japanese and Taiwanese versions. The labels change, and I think some of the outside construction is a little bit different on the BF2 in terms of color. Same is true for the HF2, but they're the same pedal. So if you're looking for these, if you're looking for a Boss BF2, don't be afraid of the newer ones. In fact, having bought an older one, now I kind of want a newer one because I can tell that this thing has just been like pretty used. Like I really have to like work the jacks, make sure they're okay. Maybe you get a nicer one in like nicer condition. This one has definitely seen some love, but at the same time, it sounds really great. So that's the pedals. The controls on both are the exact same. Manual depth, rate, and resonance. Both pedals prefer 12 volts, and you need the ACA style adapter. I just use one of the True Tone One Spot Pros, like one of the, I think it's like a C7 or something like that. It's one of the multi-spot power supplies that has switchable selections for the kind of voltage that's coming out, and it works great. One caveat about these old analog pedals is that they're a little noisy. They're not the cleanest sounding things ever. You know, if you're looking for an ultra pristine, clean sounding flanger, you should probably get into something that's very digital or, you know, analog modeled using digital technology like Line 6 stuff. But if you're okay with that, it's not that big of a deal and the trade-off is totally worth it. So what is it about these flangers that makes them so significant? It's worth noting that there are massively more amounts of BF2s out there, which means that inherently the BF2 is a more popular and tried and true staple when it comes to flanger pedals. But the thing that makes the BF2 and the HF2 so special and still so useful, and why they still have a place in the massive pantheon of pedals that we currently have, is because of how easy, quickly, and fun it is to dial in classic and familiar sounds. And that's the best thing about Boss. I say it on this channel all the time when we talk about Boss pedals, that what makes them so great and timeless is how utilitarian and normal sounding they are. The reason they sound normal is because we hear them all the time. So when you deploy that direction and that kind of flavor using a BF2, you end up getting something that sounds like music and not just guitar parts. And where the BF2 makes flangers really approachable and usable is right where the HF2 picks up and starts making things really subtle and frankly beautiful sounding. The HF2 in particular can do a really good job with bringing pretty much any part forward for the listener and making it sound a little more interesting without it being totally obvious there's a flanger or some kind of crazy effect on there. You'll probably leave most people wondering, what was that? Was that a chorus? Was that a flanger? Was it some sort of weird Leslie effect? And that's when music starts to feel like magic, when it is difficult to really tell where it comes from or how it was made. So you put all of that together and you literally have two of the best flanger pedals ever created. All right, I think that's enough talking about these. Let's get right down to how they sound. Before we get going too far, if you can do me a huge favor and hit the subscribe and the like button, I'd super appreciate that. I can't tell you how much it does to really help grow this channel and bring more videos just like this to people just like you. So thanks a ton for doing that. Let's go. All right, so let's dive in and hear what the Boss BF2 and HF2 flangers actually sound like. I've got my guitar running in stereo through both at the same time. So that means that for continuity, the examples that you hear me playing are identical going through both pedals. This should give you a pretty clear idea of what each pedal sounds like individually, without too much guesswork and too many extra variables. I'm using my Gibson Les Paul Standard, going straight in DI for both channels, right into my Universal Audio Apollo interface, and then in terms of amp in the box, I'll be using the Universal Audio Effects amp sims. The Dream Fender style amp sim for clean, and the Lion Marshall style amp sim for overdriven and dirty, heavy sounds. All right, let's get right down to it. And as always, I hope that you're not here for guitar lesson, because if you are, I definitely recommend another YouTube search.
If initially you can't do it, it's not a surprise, it's painful.
All right, so let's just start with hearing what the guitar sounds like all by itself, no effects, just straight in. All right, awesome. Now let's hear some clean sounds with these flangers. So what do I think about these two flangers? Having known the Boss BF2 many times throughout my life, and now the both of them together for like 2 or 3 years. Well, I think it goes without saying that if you don't have a flanger and you're looking for one, you definitely want to get the BF2. You want to get a full frequency flanger, or at least one like this. You know, I mentioned the Electro Harmonics Electric Mistress. There's also the MXR flanger. There's the Dan Electro Mini Hash Browns effect flanger, which I love so much. I think that was actually the first flanger I really heard and played through in person. Man, I love that thing. Or maybe it's just a flanger plugin that you have. I would definitely suggest to get like a full spectrum broadband flanger, as the kids say. But if you already have a BF2 or you have a BF3 or you have another flanger you love, then the HF2 really does play a special place. So the fact that this is like somewhere between a flanger and a chorus kind of gives it its own space. But for all intents and purposes, it's a flanger circuit and it's doing a flanger effect, but just on the high frequencies. So if you have a very heavy guitar sound, or maybe you're even playing acoustic, this can be really nice to not muddy the water. And now I say all of that to say this: both of them separate are nowhere near as good as both of them together. These two in stereo is something else. In this video, I showed you on guitar, but one of my favorite things to do when I'm mixing is to run a stereo path out and have it go to these two. It just makes things sound more interesting. So my final verdict for which one is better, I think you need both. But if you only had to get one, get the BF2. All right, so let's wrap it up. I can't say enough that there really aren't any rules when it comes to making music, especially dialing in effects. People sometimes think that every combination of guitars and effects and studio gear have all been done and used, and there's nothing new to discover. But day after day, new music, new guitar players, new producers, new engineers, vocalists, keyboardists, bassists, everybody is out there making new music that is pushing the bounds. And so there's a lot of room to keep figuring out how to get more out of the things we have, even if those things are decades old. The best part about music and sounds and the things that we create is that they travel over time and space. And that when you bring your current modern self and you apply a piece of vintage gear to it, you start to unlock things about yourself you haven't heard before and end up creating new things the world definitely needs to hear. So that's it. Thanks so much for watching. I hope this video was helpful. Please be sure to subscribe and like. I look forward to seeing you next time. Goodbye.